identifying bats in flight. Back in the day, before we had good time expansion bat detectors that we do now, people used to identify bat species looking at their flight patterns, their size and wing shape. And then eventually we then also got heterodyne bat detectors, and we used to listen to the bat calls in heterodyne only. Now we have the ability to record them and analyze the recordings on software and differentiate between the different echolocation calls and social calls. So that's very useful. However, we tend to still listen to the bats using the heterodyne function on a bat detector. And this is because if you listen to a call in time expansion, what happens is a call that is, if you have a recording, for example, that's 3.5 seconds, if you slow it down by 10 times, which is the most common time expansion factor, that call then becomes 35 seconds. And what you do with the time expansion detector as well is a call that is 50 kilohertz is then taken down 10 times in frequency, so we hear it as 5 kilohertz. And because we can hear calls that are under 20 kilohertz, that's then audible to humans, whereas 55 kilohertz wasn't. But by listening to a recording that is 3.5 seconds in time expansion, then that will then take us 35 seconds. And in terms of doing a bat survey, that's an awful long time to stand around and listening to one bat recording. And a lot of other bats could be emerging in that time, and we could miss them. So that's the reason why the bat detectors tend to have heterodyne function for listening and a time expansion function for the recording. And generally you wouldn't flip back and forth between them because it would be distracting if you were doing a professional survey. If you were out doing the survey just for training purposes, or if you were running a bat walk, or you were doing a research project, that would be different. Some people would then they will listen to heterodyne in one ear on the headphones and to time expansion on the other ear. And there are functions like that. There's also frequency division that you can listen. It's a different style. But anyway, when we do professional bat surveys, we're mainly interested in whether bats are emerging from or entering the building that we're going to demolish and maybe re-roof, or a tree that we do tree surgery or fell. So we need to focus on that, and therefore we listen in heterodyne. So the presentation I'm going to go through now is kind of a little bit about flight style and behavior and heterodyne recordings. Nocturnal bats, for example, will have long, narrow wings, and that make them really strong flyers and very fast. Whereas a lot of other species that have shorter, wider wings are more highly maneuverable and will then function better in a cluttered space rather than an open space. So an example of that would be long-eared bats. We then have different foraging behaviors. So we've got different names for them. So I was telling you how Joe Benton's bats like to forage about 1 meter above the water surface. And as they forage, they scoop up the insects from the water surface with their feet, and then they hold them with the tail membrane tucked over the insect, and then kind of chew it on the wing. So they're kind of eating and flying at the same time. And that style of foraging is called gaffing. Then we have another type of foraging, which is called hawking, or open air hawking. So that would be, example of that would be nocturnal bats and pipistrelle bats. And what they do is they tend to mainly eat smaller insects, and they just kind of like grab them in the mouth and then just swallow. So it's a very simple way of catching an insect. Then we kind of have perch feeding. So that's when you kind of have bigger insects, like for example a moth or a butterfly, and the bat would catch that, and because it's a big prey that struggles, you would then sit somewhere in peace and quiet and munch on it. And there should ideally be a place that you can fly into without having to land and crawl, but it's sheltered and quiet. Now, gleaning is a behavior. I was telling you how long-eared bats are quite vulnerable to predators, like for example cats, and often end up in bat hospitals because they are not very careful when they forage close to the ground. So Natter's bats and long-eared bats, for example, would go very close to vegetation and pick up insects from a lawn or a shrub, and kind of like pick it up and almost and touch the vegetation. And then you kind of got just like general foraging, which would be just like around vegetation. I don't think that has a name. It's just foraging in around the vegetation. So an example of that would be maybe Whisker-the-Brand's bats. When you're listening to heterodyne calls, I was talking about that it's useful to have a little bit of a musical ear if you're going to do bats. I'm not very good at bird calls. My dad always tried to teach me that as a child, and I never picked that up. I have picked up bats, but I am better when it comes to time expansion than I am with heterodyne. So if you do have a musical ear, you can kind of like hear the rhythm and the repetition rates, the kind of tonal qualities and the pitch of the noise. That's really useful skills to have. But yeah, some of us are lacking in that. So it's an individual ability. So anyway, this is an example of what the call would kind of look like. If you're looking at it as a sonogram, you've got different parts of the call. As a general thing, when bats are flying in an open area, they will produce a call that they don't produce as often. If you're in a cluttered environment and you're scared of crashing into a tree, you will produce a call on a regular basis. If you're in an open area and you know that you just have open space in front of you, there's no reason for you to echolocate as frequently. So a noctule, for example, that's foraging in an open area, will have a much slower repetition rate. Whereas if you then have a Natter's bat that is gleaning near a tree, and it's like trying to avoid crashing into it and finding insects around that tree, will have a much more quick repetition rate. Just to explain the heterodyne bat detectors again, these are the ones that are kind of like most commonly used for bat walks, and they are the cheapest type of bat detector. However, what I'm saying is that we're not using heterodyne bat detectors for our surveys. We're using Elecon detectors and Peterson G1000X. But they also have a heterodyne function where we can listen to the call as if it was a heterodyne bat detector. But a true heterodyne bat detector will, it's been quite well explained in this little slide, which is from the Bat Conservation Trust, is that it's picked up with an ultrasonic microphone and mixed with the output of a high frequency oscillator that is inside the bat detector. And this produces sounds that are the sum and difference between the two frequencies. So if the bat detector is set at 50 kilohertz and there's an incoming call that has 49, then the difference is 1, which we can hear. And that's like the functionality of the heterodyne detector. So it's not a true depiction of the sound, it's a representation of the sound that the bat makes. But it sounds pretty cute, and I'll play you all the different species now. Oh, we're going to start with lesser horseshoe bats. I mean, lesser horseshoe bats sound really interesting. Because they are the highest frequency out of all the species, they can sometimes, some bat detectors can find it difficult to pick them up. And I was mentioning that a time expansion factor that's mostly used is 10. Most people can hear that, but as you get older, your hearing will go down. So a lot of people that have experienced that will then have a different expansion factor. They will deliberately set their bat detectors so that it will be a different expansion factor, and that could be because they're older people and they're no longer able to hear the lesser horseshoe bat call. So anyway, I'll play it to you. Just little things to remember with the lesser horseshoe bats. as I said, they come up quite late, so about an hour after sunset, and they do the light sampling. They're really careful at emerging, and then they do feeding perches where you can find little moth wings, butterfly wings, and especially the greater horseshoe bat. I think possibly the lesser horseshoe bat as well. Lesser would go down on the ground and kind of pick up insects from the ground. But generally lesser horseshoe bats, because they're quite small, they kind of go for like midges and mosquitoes and the smaller size moths. And lesser horseshoe bats as well, 110 kilohertz is like the most common frequency. Now, with the bat detectors that you will be using, you won't be tuning up and down. If you were holding a true heterodyne bat detector in your hand, you would have to tune up and down to listen to the sound, to hear where the sound is the strongest, to identify species. But when you're using the type of bat detectors that we are using that has a heterodyne function rather than being heterodyne, there's generally no scrolling involved. It will just, you'll hear it anyway. So the greater horseshoe bat is easy to differentiate, because you remember the lesser horseshoe bat is only 5 grams, the greater is about 30 grams, the lesser has 110 kilohertz, whereas the greater has 85, and they sound kind of similar. And the other thing that's important to remember with the horseshoe bats is that they have a very directional call, and this is in relation to their kind of strange nose shape, the horseshoe nose. So for you to be able to get a recording, you need to kind of they need to point their nose towards your microphone. So something to be aware of when they are emerging, whether you're in the right position to get the recording or not. We're now going to talk about long-eared bats. So with the brown long-eared bats, which is the one you're going to come across the most, they have a very quiet echolocation call, and it tends to be kind of in between 30 and 40 kilohertz. However, let's see if there's someone entering. No. You tend to kind of tune your bat detector to 30 if you were deliberately trying to listen to brown long-eareds. At least that's my experience from working with a lot with brown long-eareds. That's the best frequency to listen to them. But again, we don't need to tune the detectors up and down. But if you were hypothetically using a heterodyne, that's how you would do it. And because of their kind of short, broad wings, they'll be very slow navigators. They'll almost be like fairies. They'll kind of be slowly hovering. So it's not a movement that attracts the eye that much, but you can see them, especially when they're emerging. And they will fly down to the ground and pick up things from the ground, just like horseshoe bats. See if I can play their call. So so what you're listening to here is, like a really vague flutter on the bat detector. And this is why I was saying that you need to have quite good hearing to do this job. Besides pipistrelles, or after pipistrelles, I'd say brown long-ears are probably the most common species in buildings, and they are quite difficult to survey because of the quiet echolocation calls. And when you hear this on the bat detector, you're going to think, oh, is this a pipistrelle that's flying really far in the distance? And I'm just picking up a little bit of the call, because that will sound quite similar to a long-eared bat. You also have the challenge, as I mentioned before, that it could be a quiet bat. So you could have a bat just emerging, flying past you, or returning back in the morning and not even making an echolocation call, and you're then going to have to use your eyesight to kind of spot that little movement in the dark against the sky. Yeah, that's a little bit of a skill to survey long-eared bats. Barbastelle bats, when we survey trees, obviously they're a possibility, but as I said, we'd be generally surveying garden trees and not be out in like the nice woodlands that a barbastelle bat would require. So if there are any trees in the bats in the trees, they're less likely to be barbastelles. But then on the other hand, I mentioned a barn where I had barbastelles roosting inside of the barn, so that does happen as well. So I'll play you their call. They say that this sounds a little bit like burning stubble, and it's somewhere in between kind of 30 and 40 kilohertz. They tend to be quite fast and strong flyers as well. An acquaintance of mine, he did a radio tracking of them for his PhD, and he was driving around in a 4x4 on his own. Initially, he didn't have money or funding for a research assistant, and kept losing these bats because they are just so quick and such strong flyers. So they are quite difficult to radio track. I've done a little bit of radio tracking on them myself, and you run around like a crazy person all night. The common pipistrelles, I'm going to play that to you. I mean, you're going to become very familiar with this species, but let's play them. So they echolocated around 45 kilohertz, as you know. So as I explained before, they have this playful and flickering kind of erratic style of flight. They generally emerge quite early in the evening, so you get a chance to see them, which most of the species don't. They either have a slower, less kind of more hovering style of flight, or a quicker, straighter flight. So you won't necessarily notice them as easily as you do pipistrelles. The other thing to know about pipistrelles is that after they emerge, they tend to stick around near the roost and do a little bit of foraging. Because they're quite opportunistic bats and kind of like take what's given to them, they come out and they think, why should I fly really far? I'm really hungry. Why should I fly really far to go and look for insects? I might as well scout out the garden and see if there's anything in there. So they tend to stick around after they emerged and then distract you as a surveyor with all their foraging noises when you're trying to focus on the brown long-eareds that will emerge a little bit later, and you really need your hearing and focus to hear them coming out, and you'll just have a couple of pipistrelles flying round and round the same garden. Sopranos, I mean, to me, not being a very musical person, to me the 45 and 55 sounds exactly the same as a heterodyne bat detector. what you kind of heard at the end as well was a little bit of like a feeding noise, I think, a little bit of a rasping noise there. Moving on to Nathusius pipistrelle. So this is a tree-dwelling species, so we will rarely have that coming out from a building. I've never had a Nathusius roost in a building, but that's not to say that they never exist. So anyway, the only thing kind of like important for you to know is that they echolocate a slightly lower frequency. It sounds about the same as the other two pipistrelle species, but if you've got something that's kind of down at 38 kilohertz, then you probably have a Nathusius. So kind of similar noise. And they mainly forage around kind of water bodies. So if you happen to be next to a water body, you've got more chance of hearing them. Nocturnal bats, first bats to emerge in the evening, so you'll probably hear this before you hear any other bat species. So we say that they do kind of like a chip chop noise, so kind of tick-tock chip chop. So once you've heard them a couple of times, you'll find them easy to recognize. And again, they are really loud bats, so you kind of can't miss them. But they will most likely be emerging from a tree rather than the building that you're surveying. Live slows, I'll just play them to you. Again, a tree-dwelling species. If we're going to survey like a garden tree in an urban area, they're very unlikely to be there, but you never know. So they have a slightly higher echolocation call compared to the nocturnal, so you kind of up at about 23, and they kind of have a similar chip-chop noise. And similar style of flight to the nocturnal bat. They're going to be fast and high above trees. Serotines we could come across. They live in large spaces, loft spaces, in buildings with big chimney stacks. And they emerge quite early, so kind of after the pipistrelles, they're likely to come out. I always say that they're a little bit like a Chinook chopper. They're quite big, and they have like a dark profile against the sky when they come out quite early in the evening. And they seem to fly quite slowly and have quite a slow but loud echolocation call. So they kind of come around the corner like a little bit like a chopper. And they echolocate at about 28 kilohertz. Okay, those, and they have kind of a little bit broader wings than the nocturnal bat. So they sometimes call them the jazzy bats, because they think that the noise sounds a little bit jazzy, but it definitely sounds different to the nocturnal bats. So likely after you've heard the nocturnal first, you've had the pipistrelle then the 13 bat comes out. After that, you probably have a whiskered bat if they all behave and come out in the right order. So it will sound a little bit like this. And Myotis bats generally, because they have similar echolocation calls, will sound quite similar. Okay, something I want to make you aware of in this as well, because I meant to include a call of crickets in my presentation, and then I ran out of time and forgot to add that. So I just noticed now that you listen to this recording, you can actually hear crickets at the end. So if I listen to it again, please pay attention at the end and listen to that kind of strange noise at the end. Okay, that's the noise I mean. It kind of sounds like a annoying clock ticking in a scratchy way. That's a cricket that we're picking up there at the end. Daubenton's bats, they, as I explained earlier, they're tree-dwelling species, or they might live in bridges next to the water, or like a church or cathedral building next to water. They're not known to roost in dwelling houses in the UK. Sorry, in England or Wales, but they might in Scotland. So if you hear Daubenton's bats, it's probably because the survey you are doing is next to a water body, and you have some Daubenton's bats foraging. I've stood around in gardens where you have rivers flowing next to the garden, and then it's much more likely that you're going to hear Daubenton's bats foraging just above the water surface. So you kind of combine noticing that they're flying very straight and very close to the water surface, and then they sound a little bit like this. I would listen to at 35 to hear these bats. If you tune your bat detector, if you have a heterodyne bat detector and you tune it down to 35, the Daubenton's bat will sound like a machine gun, or they say it sounds like marbles on stone floor, or a machine gun. The Bat Conservation Trust does a waterway survey, and they use heterodyne bat detectors for that, and they tune them to 35 to do that survey. So Natura's bats, as you remember, are the bat that emerges the latest out of all the bats. They will be roosting in the highest position of the building, in the darkest position of the building. It's going to be very difficult to survey them, so it's quite a skill, but it's not impossible. It can be done. And they have a very quick reputation rate, just like the Daubenton's bat. So I'm going to play that to you now. So this again is a little bit more subtle bat noise, bat recording of a bat. The sound is a little bit more subtle compared to like a pipistrelle call or the noctule or serotine, which is like really loud. This is closer to a long-eared bat where you have that kind of vague flutter noise. Because I've surveyed Natura's bats so much, I recognize this on the heterodyne detector just because it's so rapid. But it's obviously easy to confuse with other Myotis calls. We've got Bechsteins. They're just included because they are, just wanted to mention again that they're one of the whispering bats. So say if you were doing a woodland survey and someone wants to do a development through an ancient woodland, you are then as an ecologist quite motivated to prove that you have Bechstein's bats there to protect this woodland. You could then put up bat detectors in the woods, but because you can only record them from 3 to 5 meters, you may have Bechstein's bats flying around and the bat detectors simply won't pick them up because they won't be close enough to the bats, so you won't have enough bat detectors in comparison to the woodland. You have quite a few. So therefore you tend to do trapping, like mist netting or harp trapping, to identify this species in relation to development like that. They generally don't roost in buildings or garden trees in urban areas, so you're less likely to come into contact with these. But it just might be a little bit interesting to hear that call as well. It's going to sound like a vague Myotis call.